Start recording.
Me too.
Welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to have our third seminar of the series, this free seminar series for this quarter. And as I mentioned before, we're generally following the theme of soft materials and understood in the broadest sense, from things that are really soft like a gel to things that you wouldn't want to walk into while you're walking around in a shopping mall. So Andrea's topic today is on glasses, which is closer to the latter, the tougher part of the soft materials domain. It's a really great pleasure to have him today. Andrea is a postdoctoral researcher in my group in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department. He's been with us over a year. And prior to that, he was at NIST with Jack Douglas, who is very well known in the glass physics community. And he got his PhD degree in actually physics and at the University of Pisa, working mostly on computational polymer physics, looking at short time scale dynamics of glass forming liquids and trying to connect this to their rheological behavior. And a lot of his work in our department, in our group, has also been following that, but more towards applications for polymer nanocomposites that could be used in high performance structural applications. It's a great pleasure to have you, Andrea. And I will finish off with saying that he's a true Renaissance man, not just because he's from Italy, but because he has a lot of varied interests. He's mastered a lot of knowledge in glass physics, but he's also very well versed in martial arts. And if you want to learn about any topic on martial arts, including medieval sword fighting, he is the man to go to. So with that, I'll pass it on to Andrea, and please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for the kind introduction. Martial arts are extremely fun, but this topic will be, like today's talk will be about the glassy part of my broad expertise. And in particular, this story will be about the crazy amount of information we can extract from a material just by knowing how much its particles move in 1 picosecond. So that will be the theme. And this story has a lot of contributors in the past 10, 15 years. I apologize that I will have to limit myself to topics I'm mostly familiar with due to the time constraint, but there's also much more going on outside of what I will say. I certainly want to highlight 3 contributors in particular that gave like major contributions both to this story and to my career as well, so to my story. And they are my supervisor that Sinan mentioned. So Dino Leporini from Pisa for my PhD, then Jack Douglas at NIST, and finally now Professor Sinan Keten. But in the end, a story is not about the authors, right? It's about the plot. So let's dive into that. As many of our stories, this one starts in the faraway kingdom of material science, where we are faced with the daunting task of connecting the structure of new materials with their macroscopic properties, with the way they will behave and function under certain conditions, and about the best way to produce them. And this is a challenging task. One of the main reasons for that is that we often have to bridge some large gaps in the domains of space, of time, and often even of language. So as people creating new models, our work should be to create some powerful tools that are easy to describe and that can explain and exploit the connection of all these physical properties to provide advancement to the field. And my point today will be that in particular, if you take the mean square displacement of a system, which is the amount of displacement the particles of the system have in time, and you measure that displacement at 1 picosecond, that displacement that you measure, that is called the Bywalder factor or U squared, is an extremely simple yet powerful predictor of a lot of material properties. So that will be the theme, what I'll try to prove. But let me take a step back. I don't know how many of you have a favorite function. It's a bit weird, but the mean square displacement is certainly mine, and mainly because there is so much information to unpack just from this single plot. In the mean square displacement function, you'll see typically 3 regimes that I highlighted here that have a clear physical picture. The first one is what happens when you have a particle that starts moving at a constant velocity, which is preserved. That's physics 101. And you get this behavior until the particle starts bumping into a solvent, other particles, or a structure. So it starts moving erratically, trying to find the best way to move ahead, to get out of this cage. So this is the kind of movement you see, and you see this anomalous diffusion. And then eventually it managed to escape this cage, and it finds another one, and then so on and so forth. And averaging over long time scales, you see this diffusive behavior. And this kind of description is universal. I talked about small particles, but if you look at the crowded environment of a cell, that's the kind of motion you'll see. If you go to a bar tonight, you will be the particle trying to move across the room and bumping into other people. This behavior is universal. So at some point, if you hear me say like complex words, like entropy, activation, energy, like I'll often go back to this bar analogy where you are the particle. It's easy to understand what's going on behind these fancy words. But for the purpose of this talk, we'll mainly discuss the nanoscale as I plotted here in these units. In fact, I'll show a lot of results coming from simulation works that usually have reduced simulation units. So when you don't see units in the labels, you can expect that I'm referring to the picosecond and the nanometer scales. But let's discuss again this idea of escaping the cage. Now in a fluid, in a liquid of any kind, escaping the cage is some sort of relaxation process called the alpha relaxation. And the time needed to escape the cage, which is the alpha relaxation time, tau alpha, it's related to how the liquid flows. So it's actually related to the viscosity of the liquid. And the crazy thing is that for liquids, if you start reducing the temperature, but you avoid crystallization, so you're still in the liquid phase, this relaxation time will go from 1 picosecond for water, for example, up to 100 seconds. That's 14 orders of magnitude of change in the relaxation time, often in a very short, like a very narrow gap in temperature. To give you an idea, in this range, the viscosity will increase from 10 to the minus 2 poise for water. Then you have, for example, honey, which has a viscosity of 10 to the 4 poise. So that's 6 orders of magnitude larger. Then you go to tar, for example, which is highly viscous liquid with a viscosity of 10 to the 9. So that's another 5 orders of magnitude. If you go 4 orders of magnitude beyond that, at 10 to the 13 poise, that's where we define glasses. So remember that a lot of the materials you use in your real life, polymeric materials, plastics, so many of them are formally in the liquid phase, but they just flow so slowly that you can wait your whole lifetime and you'll never see them move. So because this alpha relaxation time is so critical and it changes so much, it's really important to be able to predict it for a new material, but it's also really hard. So that's why, for example, we need tools to predict this kind of relaxation. You can see actually this behavior in the mean square displacement again. If I go to this system that I showed, this curve that I showed before, and I see the effect of decreasing the temperature, you'll see that after the first ballistic regime, you have this plateau, which is the phase number 2, this caging dynamics, where you measure the Debye-Walder factor. And then after a while, you see the breakdown of the cage. That's phase 3, which happens at later and later times. In fact, if you have a solid, phase 3 will never happen. You just have vibration of your particles inside, like around their equilibrium positions. So you have just a limit for the solid phase. But okay, now let's see, how do we measure exactly this relaxation time? There are two main ways. One is to observe the intermediate scattering function. That is a function that measures the decorrelation of some scales, in this case, the scale of the cage over time. So that when this function is going down, it means that the structure is decorrelating. So here, typically you'll see two different relaxations. The first one, which is always around 1 picosecond, it's the fast beta relaxation, and it's related to this rattling motion inside the cage. And then varying with time, depending on your conditions, you'll see the alpha relaxation, the breakdown of the cage. So that's one way to measure it. And typically simulations or scattering experiments do it this way. Another way in the frequency domain is via dielectric spectroscopy, which means that you excite your system with an oscillating electric field, and you see at which frequencies the system resonate. So you'll see a broad peak for the alpha relaxation, which the frequency will change depending on the system. And then always near the picosecond, you'll find this fast process. And you'll see also this boson peak, but ignore that for now. So here is where it becomes cool. The idea that I'll show you now is that if you take two different systems with different conditions, different temperatures, different chemistry, different molecular structure, interactions, whatever, if they have the same alpha relaxation time, they also have the same Debye-Waller factor. Now, this idea is not exactly new. It was in the air since 1987, where there was a model saying that the alpha relaxation time is inversely related with an exponential law to the energy required to escape the cage. Because if you have more energy, it's easier to escape the cage. And so the alpha relaxation time will be lower. And this energy can be estimated with the Debye-Waller factor, because that measures how much you're moving in the cage. But that idea wasn't really working well for a lot of systems beside high temperature liquids. It was in 2008 that my PhD advisor, that was before I joined the group, came out with this simulation paper showing that for different systems, here you can see A, B, C, D, E. These are not 5 systems, are a lot of different systems that are tuned so that you have 5 different groups with these 5 different values for the relaxation time. They also share the same Debye-Waller factor. And by varying a lot of parameters in the simulation, you see that they all can be scaled onto a master curve where the behavior of log tau alpha is not just linear with 1 over u squared, but it has also a quadratic term due to the fact that not all cages are the same. The system is highly heterogeneous. So you have to take into account the variance of the different cages, which leads to a quadratic order. The cool part is that, okay, this is simulation, but then they tested it in the same paper for experimental data. And this plot shows that this scaling works over 20 orders of magnitude for simulation and experiments. And you can see here you have like silica, metallic glasses, glycerol, polymeric materials. It's a huge variety of systems that all behave in the same way. And at this point, the times were ripe for these ideas. In fact, Jack Douglas and its collaborator were also working on this idea. A few years later, they came out with a slightly different model called the localization model, where instead of using the idea of the energy of the cage, they had the idea of the free volume of the cage. which again can be estimated with the Debye-Waller factor. But instead of using this law that I show here with U cubed, they also took into account the fact that this cage will have a different shape. So you have to take into account some power law exponent. So this was a slightly different model, but at the time providing similar results. And also showing that how you have these clusters of these blue particles that are barely moving, and then these red particles moving around that are really letting the system flow. And it certainly can be said that then in recent years, Jack Douglas and all his collaborators worked really hard on this model and made great progress. One of the nicest idea they had is that this motion that you see, this flowing outside of the cage and of the mobile particle around these immobile clusters, it's string-like. You see these strings moving around. And if you go back to the bar, that makes sense because these clusters of immobile particles are, say, people chatting with their friends or dancing still on the floor. And if you want to move around in the crowded environment, the easiest way to do that for you is to follow other people going in the same direction. And that's how a string is formed. It emerges naturally from this heterogeneous environment. And if you measure the length of these strings, you'll notice that it changes in temperature and it increases together with the alpha relaxation time, so that these two things are actually connected. You can see these strings moving around in the simulation. And you can show here on the left that the length of the strings is related to the alpha relaxation time and also to the Debye-Waller factor, of course. It's all linked. That's not surprising because if you look to the right, you'll see that the contribution of the mobile particles to the Debye-Waller factor is actually much larger than the contribution of the immobile particles, the blue line. So the Debye-Waller factor is mainly dominated by the motion of these mobile particles and these strings. So we have this very nice picture, and this paper is fairly recent, and it's certainly progressing as we speak. This is about where I appear, at least on the peer-reviewed journals stage, in the sense that I started my PhD in 2015, and I played for a year with the basics of this model and started like playing with these ideas. And then I moved to thin films, which are a different beast altogether. Everything I showed so far works in the bulk, but if you have thin polymer films that have like a huge amount of applications, now you have surfaces that interfere with all these nice theoretical idea in the vacuum. You have a free surface with enhanced dynamics, and you have molecules that are stuck to the surface at the bottom. So you have these nice gradients in dynamics. And what I was trying to figure out was how to move all this modelization and this theory to thin films. And I failed more time than I care to share here, but in the end, we managed to have a good idea, which was to divide conceptually the film into layers, which is natural. If you look at the density distribution of the film, you'll see this nice modulation of these different layers from the solid substrate to the free surface. And if you now measure the layer by layer, again, the alpha relaxation time and the Debye-Waller factor, then globally the model doesn't work, but layer by layer, you'll see a nice scaling. Using the same model as the bulk system, you'll see that each of these layers will be in agreement with that scale. And we're pretty happy about this result. In fact, I was kind of surprised that no one published that first, Jack Douglas and his collaborators in particular. And then in that year, that same year, I joined NIST with Jack Douglas, which I didn't know before. And I asked him about this thing. And he told me that they also saw these kind of results, but they were working on the string model and different topics at the time, so they didn't have the time to publish this. But it was really nice to see that we came independently to this kind of observations. But I've been talking a lot about systems that are still viscous but fairly liquid. I don't want you to think that that's all that the bipolar factor is useful for. So with a slight change of scenario, let me go back to a figure that I told you to ignore, which is this boson peak. Now, please stop doing that, because that's really important, actually. That's a universal feature of glass formers known for decades that we still don't understand. The reason why this peak at the terahertz is so important is that, so we are talking about solids now. There's no escape from the cage. There's just rattling motion and vibration and phonons moving around the material. And from the theory of crystals, we know that if you take the density of vibrational state at this frequency, it should behave like omega squared, like the frequency squared. That's from the Debye model. And so if you plot the density of state G of omega divided by omega squared, you should see this blue line, a constant, which is the Debye level, which is related to how waves and phonons move in the material, and to material elastic properties. But for most glass formers, what you'll see is a peak in this range, which to this day, it's not fully understood. And I don't claim and we played with this a little bit. And in particular, what we simulated were 4 different systems. So atomic glasses, atomic crystals, polymer glasses, and polymer crystals. So we have these four different combinations of atomic, like atoms, polymers, glasses, and crystals. And from the vibrational density of state, you can see that the glassy systems have some additional soft modes here that are not present in the crystals. And if you plot density distribution divided by omega square, you see the boson peak, which is the same for our polymer and atomic glasses, despite the fact that their elastic properties are different, so their Debye levels are different. And we found that this was due to the fact that polymer systems have bonds that vibrate very fast. So in this really high density, the really high frequency range, they contribute to the elastic property of the system, but not to the Debye, to the boson peak. So in this case, we found that if the modulus of the system, of the polymer system, was higher than the modulus of the atomic system, so the modulus was not a good metric for the intensity of the boson peak, the Debye factor was. Why the Debye factor? In this harmonic approximation, is not black magic. The idea is that the Debye factor in harmonic approximation is just the integral over all the density of states divided by omega squared, which means that the high frequency modes of the bonds were suppressed. And so we see this nice coupling here. So I guess that's a lot of theory I discussed, a lot of fundamental properties, and a lot of these connections. But I still have not mentioned how we can use them. So if you manage to bear with me up to this point, now I'll start discussing what we can do with it. Now we built this wonderful tool that is powerful, as we observed, to predict a lot of properties, and it's time to use it. And I'll show you how we used it, me and other people, in 3 different scenarios that are much more applied. The first one is to predict the shear-thinning behavior of a polymer melt. The second one is to create a coarse-grained model for polymers. And the third one is to characterize industrial elastomers. So this is the first one, right? Shear-thinning. That's what happens when you have a viscous fluid and you apply some shear, and the viscosity of the fluid goes down. That's what happens when you use ketchup and you squeeze it out of the bottle, or when you are painting. It's also what happens if you extrude material from polymeric material from your 3D printer. So that's extremely relevant. And we still don't have a great understanding of this process in general. So that's what we did. We started playing with our polymer model, and you can measure the intermediate scattering function, this brown line at equilibrium that has the two relaxations. And you can see these clusters of immobile particles standing there. And then you start applying shear to the system. And the more you do that, the more you suppress the alpha relaxation. And the reason for that is that you are destroying these clusters, and you reach a point where the system is much more homogeneous and equally distributed. And you can see these in the intermediate scattering function, because at some point you're only left with a single relaxation, and the second long alpha relaxation is gone. So using these ideas, you can measure the alpha relaxation for your systems at different shear rate, and you'll see a plot of the relaxation time as a function of shear rate, similar to that of viscosity. And you can identify some critical shear rate at which the alpha relaxation is gone, and you have a single relaxation here. And you can do that for different temperatures or different conditions in general. And you'll see these different behavior, the same thing you see for the viscosity of any shear thinning material. And our goal was to find a way to predict that from equilibrium. So that's what we did. I won't go too much into details, but we came up with a predictive function that is able to predict the relaxation time at any shear rate for the system just from its equilibrium properties, using all these ideas of all the connection between the relaxations and equilibrium properties that we discussed so far. The second example I'll discuss is the creation of new models for our simulation. Here, the idea of coarse graining is that you start with a simulation in which you have all your atoms, and you want something simpler. You want to get rid of some degrees of freedom so that you can run simulation for larger systems and longer time. That's cool, but then the problem is that you will, this new model will result in an accelerated dynamics often. And you will see explanations like the fact that this is due to the reduction of degrees of freedom or friction or something like that. But if you go back to the bar once again, you will notice that people have, a drink or their elbow out or their cell phone. That's all stuff you can bump into. That's the friction. If you now imagine that every person is instead just a cylinder, just standing there with no bumpy sides, you move around much faster. And in fact, this discrepancy will depend on how fast you're going, or in other terms, on the temperature of the system. So that even if you recalibrate your model for a certain temperature so that the dynamics is matched between these two models, it will change again if you change the temperature. So that's a problem that Professor Ketan worked in the past year with his grad students, postdocs, and in collaboration with NIST. And what they did to solve this problem was to create some sort of calibration, this alpha parameter that can change with temperature, so that for every temperature, you're always able to match the dynamics between the two models. And to do that, they tailored it so that some specific quantities were matched between the two models. In particular, for very high temperatures, you can match the diffusion constant. Then for intermediate temperature regime, you can match the alpha relaxation time, tau. And then if you go below the glass transition, you can match, for example, the shear modulus. Now, this is a crazy effort they did. It's very good. But if you think about it now, the diffusion constant is related to the Debye-Waller factor at high temperature. The alpha relaxation time is related to the Debye-Waller factor. We saw that. And they also saw that in this case, the shear modulus was also connected to the Debye-Waller factor, because as we discussed in the boson P case, the Debye-Waller factor is still a measure of the softness of the cage. So it is in fact related to the modulus as well. And so the next step, this was 3 years ago, the next step they did, which is pretty recent, is just to forget about all these complicated metrics and just believe in the power of the Debye-Waller factor. So the only thing you need to do is actually to have your Debye-Waller factor with temperature for your atomistic system and tune the Debye-Waller factor of the coarse-grained system as well. And just by doing that, it's straightforward to create this parameterization, and they created it for a lot of different polymers, for example, polycarbonate, polystyrene, polybutadiene. And these are models that we are now using for our simulation that are coarse-grained, but still chemistry specific, which is a huge advancement. And I'm currently using these ideas to create a model for even more complicated systems, in particular for epoxy resins. Systems in which you typically have two different molecules. One is the resin and the other one is an hardener component that is able to create links with the resin and to create a polymer network. And we are now creating a coarse-grained model of this kind of system using this recalibration approach. But if you want to go even more practical than that, the last thing I'll mention very briefly is that if you now look at very complex materials in the real world, you might argue that this idea will not work perfectly. But I'll say that exactly because they are so complex, it's important to be able to have some sort of light, some sort of guiding principle to navigate the complexity of these materials. And this is what we did recently in a collaboration with industrial partners. In particular here, the person working on this project was Ao Wang, a PhD student in our group, who simulated specific model for elastomers, finding that the Debye-Waller factor was correlating with the shear, like the storage modulus and the loss modulus for these systems changing the chemistry. So that was a guide to see what was the effect of the chemistry on these mechanical and dissipative properties of these industrial elastomers. So hopefully with that, I convinced you that the simple measure of the Debye-Waller factor, which is the displacement of particles at the picosecond time scale for glass forming systems, is a powerful predictor of a huge number of properties of the material. And this is certainly a story that is not over yet. It's still developing. So I'll leave it at that for now. Well, thank you for your time, and let me know if you have questions of any sort.
Thank you very much, Andrea. You could have almost finished in half an hour, so that's really great. And you had a very good pace, I think. Really, really exciting talk. I would like to see if there are any questions from the audience. One comment I have is, I guess if you went to a bar today, it might be more in a gas space, since social distancing is supposed to be practiced, right?
Are you sure about that? It should be.
That's what I imagine living in my virtual room, but maybe it's not true. Maybe it's not true. Perhaps I can ask a question in the meantime. There's actually one question.
Sahir has a question.
Sahir has a question. All right.
So the difference between the alpha and the beta relaxation. So the beta if you have your cage, the beta relaxation is just the rattling motion of the particle inside the cage. That's a small and very fast relaxation. The alpha relaxation is the breakdown of the cage, when the particle manages to escape the cage. So that's the main relaxation that defines how the system flows and its viscosity and these kind of properties.
I guess I'll ask a quick question. So early on in the talk, you showed that the bipolar factor is like a first order approximation. In other words, like a harmonic approximation of the rattling. And then you show that there's also like second order terms and maybe potentially higher order terms. Can you think of applications where these higher order terms could benefit you? For instance, do you think that they could be useful in systematic coarse graining applications or other areas where they matter, and you can't simply think of just the Debye-Waller factor?
So the case I described was for the model developed by Leporini and his co-workers, where they envisioned that this activation energy picture, where instead of having a single descriptor, which is just the Debye-Waller factor, you had to take into account that there is a Gaussian distribution of the Debye-Waller factor, so the heterogeneity of the system. So they resolved that with this second order term. Now Jack Douglas and his co-workers, so David Simmons and others, resolved that with a power law, which is not exactly the power law of a sphere. So instead of imagining like spherical cages, they had to take into account, that the shape of the cage was not exactly spherical. So I guess in some way or the other, these higher order effects are coming into play, but they are now integrated, for example, in the localization model. So I guess, yeah, the most powerful tool we have today is probably the localization model and the string model for the description of these quantities, which seems to work well, at least above the glass transition. Then the question becomes, that's an open question, what happens to these properties below the glass transition when this coupling doesn't really work anymore? But it's hard for simulation to work in that regime, so that becomes a bit more challenging to understand.
Thank you, Andrea. Questions from the audience? You could simply type your question in the chat box, or just speak up. Since we're a relatively small group, that should be fine too. Any other questions, comments? There's a question from Martha. Could you describe how the Debye-Waller factor is used in the epoxy system and how it is considered in cross-linking?
So in that system, the idea, we are not working on the temperature transferability yet, but in the epoxy system, the idea was to match the Debye-Waller factor before the cross-linking. So that was our starting point. And then when you start adding cross-links, there is a decoupling between the Debye-Waller factor and the mechanical properties because of the network, which is something that all the theory I discussed about doesn't take into account. So what we did was to reparameterize the system in the same way that the energy normalization procedure does across different cross-link, like degrees of cross-linking, while preserving the key quantities we cared about, in particular, the density, the Debye-Waller factor, the elastic modulus, and the yield stress at any degree of cross-linking.
Any other questions? I see John asked me the question of whether we'll post these seminars online. I think we will. I don't know if the older ones have been posted yet, but I'll follow up after this one to make sure that we share the seminars online. Of course, with permission from the speakers.
Sounds good.
I guess that wraps up for today. Thank you, Andrea, for keeping things on time and for giving us a nice colloquial talk about this subject. That's probably new to a lot of people in the audience. So we'll continue on next week at the same time. Thanks again for everyone for staying online in this beautiful weather today. Hope you get to enjoy it in the rest of the afternoon. And take care, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.